Elliot was a man lost in his own world, one made of colors, textures, and abstract thoughts. He had always been a solitary artist, choosing to spend most of his time in his quiet loft, where the only company he kept was the hum of his own brush strokes. His art wasn't simply his job, it was the way he expressed feelings he couldn't speak. Every canvas was a mirror, reflecting his inner struggles, his joys, his deepest pains. He lived for these moments of creation, where his hands moved in a trance, painting pieces that captured parts of himself he couldn't put into words. To Elliot, each painting was an extension of his soul, a silent declaration of who he was in a world that often misunderstood him. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about capturing the raw emotion of existence and pouring it into something tangible for others to experience. Isabel entered his life like a breath of fresh air at an opening night for an exhibit featuring Elliot's work. She was a collector, but more importantly, she was someone who felt art deeply. Unlike the typical buyers who valued art as a financial asset or a status symbol, Isabel approached each piece with an emotional openness that caught Elliot's attention. Her eyes lingered on one of his paintings, Fragmented Dreams, and something sparked between them, an unspoken connection. The painting depicted a figure engulfed in stormy chaos, with fractured reflections mirroring its turmoil. Isabel felt an almost overwhelming resonance with the piece. Something deep inside her clicked. She didn't know why the painting moved her so much, but she could see herself in it, her own inner conflict mirrored on the canvas. It wasn't just the visual appeal, but the emotional rawness of the work that drew her in. That night, she purchased the painting and arranged a private viewing with Elliot, curious to explore what lay beneath the surface of his art. Their first conversation felt natural, almost effortless. Isabel was different from the usual crowd that followed Elliot's exhibitions. She wasn't just interested in his paintings as a commodity, but was genuinely curious about the artist behind the work. They began talking about the process behind his creations, and Elliot found himself surprised by how easy it was to open up to her. Isabel shared stories of her upbringing, her struggles with her overbearing father, who expected her to follow a rigid, business-oriented path in life. She confessed that she often felt overshadowed by her family's expectations and unsure of her own identity in the art world. Elliot, in turn, spoke about his childhood marked by emotional neglect, with parents who never understood his passion for painting. These conversations, often late at night or in quiet cafes, created a bond that felt both comforting and vulnerable. Isabel had never met anyone who saw her as more than just an art collector, and Elliot had never met anyone who truly listened to him. Over time, their relationship began to evolve, and the dynamic shifted. Isabel's fascination with Elliot's art deepened, but in a way that began to feel consuming. She visited his studio often, sometimes unannounced, drawn by an insatiable desire to understand the artist behind the paint. She stood in front of his pieces for hours, dissecting every detail, asking endless questions about his inspirations and techniques. But it wasn't just about the art anymore. Isabel was slowly becoming fixated on the man behind it. She sent him long, thoughtful messages about how his work made her feel, sometimes pouring her heart out in ways she hadn't intended. She spoke of wanting to be his muse, the one who could inspire him in ways no one else had. This began to unsettle Elliot. At first, he appreciated the attention. But as her messages became more intense and her visits more frequent, he started to feel overwhelmed. He valued the space that art gave him to breathe and think, but Isabel's need for connection seemed to be encroaching on that sacred space. Elliot's anxiety grew as he realized Isabel's obsession wasn't just with his work, it was with him. He sensed that she had projected her own unmet needs onto him, seeing in his paintings the emotional depth and complexity that she craved in her own life. The more she clung to him, the more he withdrew, feeling the weight of her expectations. He began to avoid her calls and messages, using his work as an excuse to stay in his studio longer than necessary. This, of course, only fueled her desperation. Isabel began to interpret his silence as rejection, which made her even more determined to understand him, to figure out why he was pulling away. She thought perhaps he was just afraid of intimacy, afraid to let anyone get close. But in reality, Elliot was simply trying to protect himself from becoming a source of her emotional dependence. He had always kept his emotions guarded, and now, for the first time, he was afraid that his work had become an avenue for someone else's emotional escape, rather than a true expression of his own voice. The turning point came one evening when Elliot could no longer hold in his frustration. Isabel had arrived uninvited at his studio yet again, standing in front of a new painting, her gaze fixed intently on it. He couldn't take the quiet tension anymore. He confronted her, his voice tight with emotion. "You don't know me, Isabel. You don't know who I am behind these paintings. You're obsessed with what you think I represent, not with me as a person." His words came out sharper than he intended, but the weight of his frustration was undeniable. Isabel was taken aback. She had never seen him so vulnerable, so raw. It was as if the walls he had carefully built around himself had crumbled in one moment of truth. For the first time, she saw the damage her fixation on him had caused, not just to their relationship, but to his sense of self. She had projected her own need for validation and connection onto him, without truly understanding the man behind the art. The realization stung, and for the first time, Isabel understood that her obsession had crossed a line. After the confrontation, Isabel retreated, giving Elliot the space he had asked for. She spent a lot of time reflecting on her behavior, realizing how much she had relied on Elliot's work and presence as a way to fill a void within herself. Her obsession had been a coping mechanism, a way to escape her own loneliness and unfulfilled desires. It wasn't that she didn't care for Elliot, she did, deeply, but she had been using him to avoid facing her own inner conflicts. She realized that she needed to work through her emotional baggage on her own before she could offer anyone, especially Elliot, the kind of love that wasn't rooted in dependency. It wasn't an easy journey. Isabel spent months working through her fears, taking a step back from the art world and focusing on herself. She explored her own interests outside of her father's influence, learned to set boundaries, and began developing her own identity. It wasn't about forgetting Elliot or his art, it was about finding peace within herself so that she could love in a healthier, more balanced way. Meanwhile, Elliot retreated into his work, but this time, something had changed within him too. With the distance between him and Isabel, he was able to see things with greater clarity. He painted more freely, no longer burdened by the pressure of others' expectations. His work became richer, not just in technique but in honesty. It was as though the space he had needed to breathe was also the space he needed to grow. He no longer viewed art as a means of validation, but as a pure form of self-expression. In those months of silence, Elliot also realized something important. He missed Isabel, not just as a collector or an admirer of his work, but as a person who had seen him for who he truly was, imperfections and all. He missed their conversations, their shared moments of vulnerability. But he also understood that for them to truly connect, They both had to learn to love themselves first. When they finally reconnected, it was under completely different circumstances. Isabel had grown, both personally and professionally. She had stepped away from her role as an art collector and had focused on helping lesser-known artists find their voice. Elliot, too, had changed. He had stopped running from his emotions and his past, and his art reflected that new authenticity. Their conversation felt natural, no longer weighed down by past misunderstandings. They talked not about art, but about their lives, their struggles, and their growth. There was no pressure this time, no expectations. Just two people who had learned to understand themselves better and were now ready to understand each other. As the evening wore on, Isabel looked at Elliot with a soft smile. "I think I finally understand your art," she said. "It's not about the paintings themselves. It's about what's hidden in the space between the brush strokes, the quiet moments when you let yourself just be." Elliot's heart swelled with quiet joy, and for the first time, he felt truly seen, not for his art, but for who he was as a person. They didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, they knew their love wasn't built on obsession, or the need to fill emotional gaps. It was built on mutual respect, understanding, and a deep appreciation for the spaces between their hearts that allowed them both to grow. They had learned that love isn't about filling each other's voids, it's about standing side by side, fully knowing each other, and accepting one another's flaws. And as they stood together, a new chapter of their relationship began, one where both of them were free to be their true selves, with all their complexities, and where love was not a possession, but a shared journey of growth.